Corporate complicity in war, forced displacement, and genocide is not a new concern, but in the context of Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza, it has taken on renewed urgency after the release of a groundbreaking report by Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Her report, titled From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide, identifies 48 corporations contributing to or directly profiting from Israel's unlawful actions, including major U.S. tech companies. These actions breach international law, including the Genocide Convention. The report not only focused on defense companies that have provided weapons used by the Israeli military, but also companies spanning industries from real estate and travel to academia and finance, a broader database of over 1,000 corporate actors whose activities can be linked to Israel's policies and operations in the occupied territories was put together for the investigation. As powerfully stated in the report itself, while life in Gaza has been obliterated and the West Bank is under escalating assault, this report shows why Israel's genocide continues, because it is lucrative for many. After the report was released, the United States said it would issue sanctions on Albanese. Now, for the listeners who may not follow these types of actions closely, for the U.S. to sanction a named individual, especially an independent expert of the UN, who, just as a side fact, serve in their personal capacity and don't receive any financial compensation, is no small response. After the report's release, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, quote, "We will not tolerate these campaigns of political and economic warfare which threaten our national interests and sovereignty," which effectively can be translated to, "We will not tolerate anyone who tries to hold us or our corporate friends accountable for aiding in widespread terror." The U.S. government's threat of sanctions is not just an attempt to silence her, but also an indication that her report is a threat to what can be seen as the unshakable power held by global superpowers, both nation-states and corporate actors. To better understand the role of corporations in genocide and the implications of this report on states and corporate entities, I'm joined by Lydia de Leeuw, researcher and strategic litigation lead at SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations.
Thank you so much for having me. We're based in Amsterdam. And what we do is basically we investigate the role of multinationals in human rights violations, in armed conflicts, in situations of armed occupation, but also the climate crisis, issues around economic justice. So it's a very wide variety of social justice issues. And my work has, for the past 15 years, been heavily focused around Palestine, and then since the start of this genocide, investigating the role of corporates and trying to support efforts to hold them to account where possible. I also used to work and live in Gaza and in Nablus with Palestinian human rights organizations. So that also is part of my life.
To open this conversation, I want to start with some background outlined in the report itself. So, the role of corporations in the occupation of Palestine is deeply embedded in the broader framework of settler colonialism, a system rooted in the extraction of land and resources, and a process long enabled and sustained by corporate entities. Since 1967, corporate involvement has expanded, materially supporting Israel's destruction of Palestinian homes, infrastructure, and livelihoods, while helping entrench a segregated and militarized landscape. Corporations have effectively supplied the machinery of occupation: bulldozers, surveillance technologies, weapons, Beyond military support, corporations have also profited from the systemic suppression of the Palestinian economy. Israeli and international firms have extracted labor and natural resources while imposing restrictions on agriculture, water access, fishing, and trade, turning the occupied territories into effectively a captive market. This economic strangle has been compounded by the Oslo Accords, which institutionalized Israel's control over vast swaths of the West Bank, costing the Palestinian economy an estimated 35% of its GDP. Financial institutions, including banks and asset managers, have funneled capital into the infrastructure of occupation, while academic institutions have helped legitimize and advance its technological underpinnings. Since October 2023, the economy of occupation has rapidly evolved into an economy of genocide. In fact, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has risen by 179% since the assaults on Gaza began. So, why is this report such a significant intervention at this particular moment?
Yeah, I think for a number of reasons. Obviously, the situation is as urgent as it can possibly be, and that's only increasing with the day. Also, we're seeing such state inaction, unimaginable levels of state complicity. So I think we, as in, international community that wants to stop this genocide, that wants to stop this illegal occupation, are looking for all the possible leverage and entry points to do so and to push for an end to the ties of complicity. So our states are complicit, our states are providing political cover, arms, etc. But also our corporates, the corporations that, that are taking care of our financial transactions, the companies that, people will often use to book accommodation when they go on a trip, your supermarket, etc., etc. So I think it helps expose yet another layer of complicity, which we have leverage over, because I think it is a helpful antidote to a sense of powerlessness. I mean, obviously, we don't hold enough power to stop things today and to save lives today, but understanding better what the corporate involvement is and where and how there are levers to stop it, I think is really critical. And in Gaza, all of that comes together in a system. So what the special rapporteur exposed is at the sectoral level, it's at a company level, but she also said this is just the tip of the iceberg. The companies that you find in the report, many of which you will know are familiar to you, they're just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is with the system.
International human rights law is built on the principles of dignity, equality, and liberty, focusing primarily on the obligations of states to uphold and protect these rights. But there's a critical blind spot: the role and responsibility of non-state actors, especially corporations. Much of the legal discourse remains state-centric while overlooking the immense power wielded by multinational companies, some of whom operate with budgets that can exceed the GDP of entire countries. This tremendous capital means that multinationals can sometimes wield more power than nation-states themselves. That kind of economic weight gives them not only the ability to sidestep regulations, but to actually shape them. When corporations hold this level of influence, ignoring their accountability isn't just a legal gap, it's a systemic failure.
And they have shaped them. I think we would have had different laws, regulatory frameworks. We would have international binding norms on corporates if it wasn't for their power, right? And the clout that they hold. I mean, I hope that in our lifetime, we will see the day that we think, or the generations that come after us will ask us, what was wrong with you? How was it possible that there was no binding international legal framework applying to companies, corporate entities? How was that even, an option? How did everyone just think it was normal to leave them in a total vacuum of impunity? It is really absurd because they, just like you said, they have so much influence over our lives. And I think what the largest atrocities in the past have shown is that a large scale especially over a longer period of time, atrocities can only be designed, carried out, and continued with the involvement of corporations. From slavery to the Holocaust, to South Africa apartheid, you see corporations there in the architecture of the atrocity crime, whether it is the segregation of two peoples, whether it is the physical destruction, organizing the physical destruction of a people, all of that. And we're seeing it now again in its current form in Gaza. And then being sold as, advancement of technology, because it is now being sold and marketed as something that is, I can't even utter the words, like battle tested or combat proven. It is on full display how companies are designing the destruction of a people.
Yeah, and Gaza is being used quite literally as a testing ground. One of the most powerful aspects of the report for me is the grounding in historical context. It reminds us that global inequalities are not accidental or recent. They're the product of centuries of colonialism and imperialism. The report's introduction leads with an incredibly bold sentence. Colonial endeavors and associated genocides have historically been driven and enabled by the corporate sector. Citing the book Empire Incorporated by historian Philip Stern, in that book, Stern outlines how over 4 centuries, British colonialism was fundamentally a corporate project. Corporations like the British East India Company weren't just participants, they were architects. They financed, governed, and expanded empire, making claims over land and people while ensuring that both British and colonial societies were materially invested, literally, in their success. And this venture colonialism didn't end with the wave of formal decolonization. Its legacies continue to shape the global economic system today through unchecked corporate powers. Within the international human rights framework, it is no surprise that the legacy of colonialism continues to undermine the protection of rights, particularly in how power is distributed and exercised at both national and global levels. So, from your perspective, as someone who's been on the ground in Palestine and has bared witness to the systems that continue to displace communities, why is this historical context around global economic inequality so important to the framing of the report? And what does it unlock in terms of how we understand accountability today?
Because I think it honestly can only be understood in that historical context. And yes, this is a contemporary example happening in front of our eyes, but we cannot disconnect it because this was only possible because we didn't break with that system historically. It remained in place. It remained intact. And if we don't stop it here, and this is also why every international legal expert that talks about the issue says, this is international law, the international legal order, or what it was worth to begin with, right? Because it was built on colonial parameters. It's now on a knife's edge, and we have to decide whether we keep it, protect it, improve it drastically, or whether we let it go altogether. And this is the choice. I think there's very little in between, to be honest. I'm afraid that if we don't act, this will be yet another blueprint for the future. What Gaza has really made so painfully clear is that how the cracks in the system were already there, right? If there's anything that Gaza showed is that the system was always vulnerable to a repetition of history. So the slogan "never again" is really just a slogan, unless there's political will to implement it. We need to keep striving for an accountability of those corporates that are in full openness involved in the atrocities that are being committed in Palestine. By the way, this report, it's timely, it's urgent, it is very revealing. But many of the companies that the UN Special Rapporteur lists in the report have been on the UN database since February 2020. That was a really heavily fought over database that almost didn't see the light of day due to political pushback. Companies were listed by name. It was indicated what type of involvement those companies had in the illegal Israeli settlements. and nothing happened. There was precisely zero action from states to, prevent the continuation of their corporations' involvement in the settlements. No efforts of accountability whatsoever. What we have seen is some divestments, for example, as a result of those listings, but state action has just been minimal. So the information isn't entirely new. What is very helpful, though, at the end of the reports, the Special Rapporteur very clearly sets out pathways to break with this cycle of impunity, because there's a legal groundwork that we can build on, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we need to unpack. But before we dive deeper, I want to take a moment to ground our listeners in how this report expands and really challenges our current understanding of corporate complicity in international crimes. Because I would argue this remains a gray area, not just in public discourse, but in the law itself. I think for the average person, the logic feels simple. If a company is doing harm, especially something as serious as contributing to war crimes or genocide, then it should be held accountable. That seems intuitive, but legally, it's far from straightforward. There are major jurisdictional hurdles. If a company is headquartered in one country, but its actions are contributing to abuses in another, whose laws apply? And can victims even access justice across borders? For example, in the US, we have the Alien Tort Statute, which was once seen as a potential tool for holding corporations accountable for human rights abuses abroad. But in practice, it's been severely limited. I mean, we saw this with Nestle v. Doe, where the US Supreme Court ultimately ruled against holding Nestle and Cargill liable for aiding and abetting child slavery in the Ivory Coast. And it wasn't until fairly recently, with the Chiquita Banana case, that we saw a US court hold a company accountable for human rights violations abroad. So when we look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, there's a clear framework. States are the primary duty bearers. They're supposed to regulate corporate conduct, especially companies operating within their own jurisdiction. But the reality is enforcement is a suggestion at best. So while there are norms that apply to corporations, like the responsibility to respect human rights, those norms, as of now, aren't legally binding. Without enforceable mechanisms, accountability remains largely aspirational. So from your perspective, how do you see this report pushing that conversation forward? How does it challenge the current legal and normative frameworks that continue to let corporations off the hook?
We should all strive towards changing that in the future. But at the domestic level, I do think that we have been seeing an evolution in terms of accountability work. Increasingly, there have been cases against corporate executives and also against corporate entities as such, both civil and criminal, in different jurisdictions. So I don't think there's nothing to work with, especially when it comes to criminal cases. You often depend on the willingness of the prosecutor to investigate, to indict. That is a limitation in terms of your chances of going after a powerful actor. But also, again, I think power and influence and political clout are time-bound. So I don't think anything is static, really. It's about picking the right battle at the right time. And civil litigation, which is much more costly, and then it really becomes a David and Goliath situation where you're taking on a corporation that has dozens of lawyers at their disposal, and you're up against that with limited resources, normally speaking, as a civil society organization or collective. So that is challenging even when you do have the law on your side. The report talks about legal avenues, but also what measures willing states, or any state really, can be taking apart from prosecuting and apart from legal proceedings. So sanctions, asset freeze, preventing and stopping the trade and investment flows, because there's a lot there that wouldn't necessarily shape up into legal proceedings against an individual corporation, but it is really targeting things at a systemic level rather than going after individual corporates one after the other.
The report identifies a range of sectors: arms manufacturers, tech firms, tourist industry, building and construction companies, service industries, banks, agribusiness, pension funds, insurers, universities, and charities as enabling crimes of apartheid and genocide within the occupied Palestinian territory. Many of the companies named in the report operate globally and are headquartered in the US and Europe. Reflecting particularly on some of the US companies named in the report, these companies yield immense political power through lobbying and financial contributions. I want to take a moment to actually read something from the report that I believe really gets to the heart of this. Quote, corporations and their home states, primarily global minority states, continue to exploit structural inequalities rooted in colonial dispossession. Meanwhile, weaker regulatory systems in formerly colonized states and development and investment imperatives mean corporations often evade accountability. End quote. Reflecting on the recent threat of sanctions by the United States against the special rapporteur shortly after the report was published, the question I believe really becomes, what does it actually mean to hold corporations accountable when states are so intertwined with corporate interests?
Well, clearly she's onto something, right? I think if her report didn't make anyone nervous, there wouldn't have been sanctions. So she's hitting a nerve. So to unpack that a little further, even though they're very powerful, have very deep pockets, and can basically buy political power, they're not immune to every type of attack on their image, reputation. So I think a lot of the companies that were mentioned in Albanese's report are really household names. So the more these names become associated with genocide, with just the relentless killing of a people that we are all watching live streamed on our phone day in, day out. I mean, we saw this with McDonald's. In many countries, profits went down by a lot. So consumer boycotts are something that I think many of those companies are wary of. I'm wondering what is possible in the realm of shareholder action. I'm wondering what is possible when workers decide, just like we've seen with dock workers, examples of really courageous workers putting their interests on the line to stop their company from continuing their complicity. So one historical example that I remember from my research time in South Africa, looking at the corporate involvement in the crime of apartheid, it was actually workers of Polaroid who discovered that their company was the one that was making the photography equipment for the South African apartheid regime.
In 1972, Black American Polaroid employees discovered that the company was actively supplying photographic equipment to the South African apartheid government, which used it to produce ID cards and passbooks that enforced apartheid, a symbol of institutionalized racism. The Polaroid employees, Carolyn Hunter and Ken Williams, decided to take action and founded the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, mobilizing colleagues to demand that Polaroid sever ties with South Africa. Their campaign escalated rapidly. Both Hunter and Williams testified before the United Nations Special Committee on Apartheid, urging a global boycott of Polaroid products. Polaroid, of course, in return, retaliated. But despite corporate pushback, the workers' movement gained momentum. And eventually, after years of tireless worker organizing and global mobilization efforts, Polaroid halted all direct sales to the apartheid state.
You never know. Butterfly effects can be started with the report, with people becoming more aware, workers, consumers. We've seen it in the Netherlands, people putting their money in a different bank over moral concerns, be it climate, be it arms industry. Knowledge is power. And we're still a long way from, from equating to the power of these big corporates. But there's clearly a threat to their power if there's sanctions imposed on the UN Special Rapporteur after this report specifically. And she is pointing to areas in the law which haven't been used enough or to their full potential. I meant, for example, the anti-money laundering frameworks that are relatively strong in a lot of countries can be used. SOMO, together with 3 other organizations, have used it to file a criminal complaint against Booking.com in the Netherlands over their listings of accommodation in the illegal Israeli settlements. That criminal complaint is under review, and we have to see, whether the prosecutor will go ahead and make actual moves. This same anti-money laundering framework can be applied to across the illegal settler economy, because the entire economy is unlawful. The proceeds that you take from there are proceeds of crime. Another area is in the individual criminal liability of corporate executives. The continuous decision-making to be involved, to provide the means for atrocity crimes. Some of them even publicly defending that. The evidence is so overwhelming. The knowledge is undeniable.
Yeah, we're living at a moment in time when you truly cannot deny that you were unaware of the conditions your company was operating in.
So I really do think for some of those corporate executives, they may not know it yet, but it's just a matter of time until there's justice coming their way. And we should all be keeping receipts and building up documentation of their involvement.
Let's talk about executive accountability, because the report doesn't treat corporations as faceless entities. It names names. One particularly striking example is the CEO of Palantir. Since Trump first took office, Palantir has secured over $113 million in contracts to build detailed surveillance profiles of Americans with a focus on tracking immigrants. Their technology maps real-time movements, monitors social media, generates biometric data, and traces networks of association, turning vast amounts of personal information into powerful tools of surveillance under the guise of national security. What's deeply alarming is that these tools were initially tested on Palestinians. Palestine has long served as a laboratory for surveillance technologies. And in January 2024, Palantir deepened its ties with Israel through a new strategic partnership, going so far as to hold a board meeting in Tel Aviv in solidarity. And then in April 2025, when the company was accused of enabling the killing of Palestinians in Gaza, the CEO responded, "Mostly terrorists, that's true." So we're not talking about passive complicity. We're talking about active endorsement. These are executive level decisions made with full awareness of how their technology is being used. The Palantir example is critical because it reveals how deeply interconnected systems of oppression are. Technologies developed and deployed to target one marginalized community rarely stay confined. They set dangerous precedents. What begins as surveillance against one group can quickly expand into broader tools of control, repression, and state violence.
Yeah, at the moment, I think the 2 primary avenues are the International Criminal Court, because the International Criminal Court is a court where you can sue individuals. So those that are in leadership positions in companies where they were the ones overseeing and deciding on the involvement of their corporation with a certain degree of intent and knowledge, and where the contribution that the company made and the behavior of that executive made to the commission of the crimes, the predicate offenses by Israel and the Israeli armed forces, there's definitely a case to be made for prosecution of such individuals before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It hasn't happened before, but the Rome Statute, which is the founding statute of the International Criminal Court, has the framework for it. There's no exclusion of corporate executives. Basically, the separation is between military commanders on the one hand and civilians with a certain authority. So I think that is a very important avenue that we should all focus more on and use.
I do think it's important to note that the International Criminal Court relies on state cooperation and has jurisdiction over crimes committed in the territory of or by nationals of countries that have ratified the Rome Statute, unless referred by the UN Security Council. Of course, neither the United States nor Israel have ratified the Rome Statute.
And then there's the domestic courts. Depending on the domestic legislation, individuals can be held liable for their aiding and abetting of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And in the Netherlands, over the past few decades, we've had two examples of Dutch corporate executives being held responsible for aiding and abetting in war crimes. One over arms deliveries to Charles Taylor, who used those arms in war crimes in Liberia. And the other one over providing the chemical components with which Saddam Hussein built the chemical weapons that he then used to massacre the Kurds. So these men were convicted. They were sentenced to long prison sentences. So this is not theory. This is not just a daydream of people that are working on a corporate accountability. This actually happened. And I don't know if people know this, but this is, again, not only just very recent jurisprudence. There were also corporate executives, individuals that were tried at the Nuremberg tribunals and convicted for their role in the genocide. So again, that's why I'm very confident in saying it's just a matter of time before it happens with the executives that are complicit in the crimes in Gaza.
Absolutely. After the Nuremberg tribunals following World War II, corporate executives were prosecuted and convicted for their roles in enabling Nazi atrocities. One notable case was of the IG Farben trial, where top executives were held accountable for supplying the chemical gas used in concentration camps and for exploiting forced labor. These trials established a critical precedent that business leaders could be held individually responsible for crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes, not just political or military officials. So why haven't we seen any movement yet on this? What are some of the challenges you see that prevent executives from being held accountable?
Yeah, I think, again, this is not based on study on my part, but I think some of the explanation is that historically, how the genocide conventions were established, where the Rome Statute came from, those were coming from quote unquote traditional conflict settings. So it was often, state against state. It was often a military against another armed group. And the traditional thinking and analysis was always focused on military command structures. And then next to that was, well, we have to deal with those who call the shots politically, those who were in the political leadership that decided on implementing certain crimes. And I think that the thinking around the involvement of corporations and just the understanding of the relevance of corporations and their influence and their determining role in how these atrocity crimes are being committed, in the implementation of them, I think is really understudied. Another thing that I think is a challenge, or maybe a challenge within the context of the International Criminal Court, is that you do need specialized investigations to follow the money. You need to understand and study the beast, before you can tell where its responsibility lies. Again, some corporate executives make that very easy because they're boasting about how their technology is being used in the commission of crimes. But then the mission of the prosecutor is to go after those most responsible. They're going for the ones that really were the orchestrators and the worst perpetrators in those atrocity crimes. Often corporate actors aren't seen as such, but I think especially with the technology and the artificial intelligence that have decided who would live, who would die based on some algorithms, that has to, I think, be translated into such calculations by a prosecutor who was most responsible for the design and the implementation of these crimes.
Absolutely. And I think what you said earlier really gets to the heart of it. Historically, the focus of accountability in situations of conflict or genocide focused primarily on state actors, military commanders, political leaders, the people giving the orders. But we rarely ask who's enabling these orders to be carried out, who's designing the tools that make these systems of control possible. What we're seeing now, especially with advancements in technology, is that the line between the command and the capacity to act is increasingly blurred. In many cases, it's not just military leaders making decisions in a vacuum. These decisions are shaped by the capacities corporations put on the table. When a technology company offers AI powered surveillance or biometric tracking or massive data aggregation systems, they're not just providing tools, they're planting the infrastructure that makes state violence more efficient, more targeted, and more scalable. So, yes, this is a shift, and frankly, it's not one that the law has fully caught up with. I remember flipping through my international human rights law textbook during my master's, and the section on non state actors was pretty small. And of course, the section on corporations was even more brief. If we're serious about accountability, we can't ignore the architects behind the systems of oppression, especially when they're profiting from them.
Which I find, I mean, once you see it, you can't unsee it, I think. But it is shocking. It is bizarre when you look at the crime of slavery, when you look at the crime of apartheid. I mean, it had the corporate fingerprints. It's still mind blowing to me that we're advancing this field in at such a slow pace. And also you see repeat offenders. So for example, IBM, they were the ones that, going back in recent history, they were the ones that really helped design the whole, racial segregation, the computing, apartheid. And guess what? They're all over the apartheid system of Israel in Palestine.
I mean, IBM has had a significant and long-standing presence. It's impossible to talk about Israel's reputation as a so-called startup nation without acknowledging the foundational role played by tech giants like IBM and Hewlett-Packard. These companies didn't just show up recently. They've been embedded in the region's tech infrastructure for decades. Their presence isn't incidental. It's deeply woven into the system of occupation.
Yeah, and I think that the tech sector of Israel takes a certain flight because, like you said, it's a testing ground. This is really a time to wake up to the fact that there's a shaping influence and a very powerful influence of corporates in these very dark times and crimes.
Yeah, you touched on this a bit earlier on the concept of aiding and abetting, and I want to dig into that a bit more because I think this is where things often get murky. Historically, companies have used complex legal structures, subsidiaries, shell companies, layered subcontractors to create a kind of legal distance between themselves and potential harms, effectively fragmenting responsibility across a complex supply chain to obscure accountability. Most corporate involvement isn't blatant. Instead, it's embedded into financial flows, logistical support, data infrastructure, and partnership. And that's why I find the report so important. It pushes beyond a narrow interpretation of aiding and abetting. It expands the conversation around corporate complicity to include the structural and financial scaffolding that enables international crimes. It's not just about intent, it's about a company's operations, investments, and technologies materially supporting the systems of violence. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. How does the report reframe complicity to hold corporations accountable, not just for overt acts, but for the roles they play in sustaining the infrastructure of occupation and genocide?
Yeah, I think that's where two directions really are helpful to some extent. So in one direction, the special rapporteur points to the role of states as the primary duty bearers and having to tackle trade flow as a whole and investment flow as a whole, rather than individual examples where you could prove theoretically aiding and abetting it is about the system. So you can't be sending financing into the system that is then used to violate the right to self-determination, right to life, and everything in between. So it is incumbent upon states to take very concrete measures to regulate and to stop, to cut these ties. And then the second part, which is also, again, only helpful to some extent, is the framework of the UN Guiding Principles, right? Which is a normative framework. It has, in some cases, like the Shell case in the Netherlands, been used to interpret binding obligations. So it's only helpful to some extent. What we need is binding rules. But the guiding principles help us understand what the responsibilities are, or rather, what states have agreed the responsibility of corporate actors are. So they need to exercise due diligence. They need to know what the risks of their operations and business relationships are. And if they can't mitigate those risks, they have to responsibly disengage from those business relationships. So the wording that states jointly and unanimously created and put on paper in 2011 is very clear. And under that framework, no corporation should be operating in the settlements at all, and in large parts of the Israeli industry likewise. So I think that is a very clear framework with very clear implications, but the enforceability, that's where the problem lies, obviously.
You mentioned due diligence, and a lot of emphasis is given to due diligence in the business and human rights space. It's considered the golden standard for preventing harm and more often than not treated as a checkbox. On paper, in business and human rights, due diligence is an active process used by companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how their operations affect human rights. It's a proactive approach to identify potential and actual negative human rights impacts and to take appropriate actions to address them. The Special Rapporteur states in her report that had proper human rights due diligence been undertaken, many corporate entities would have long ago disengaged from Israel's occupation.
I would even say they wouldn't have gotten involved, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a powerful indictment, right? It suggests that not only have companies failed to assess and mitigate their human rights impacts, they've willfully ignored the warning signs. Also, due diligence isn't meant to be after the fact. Due diligence is meant to be preventative.
Well, exactly. Due diligence is supposedly, for the most part, aimed at preventing you from becoming involved, just much like the Genocide Convention wasn't made to be able to hold to account the genocidal actors after the fact. It was designed predominantly, that's why it's in Article 1, to prevent acts of genocide.
I appreciate you mentioning that because it's really not uncommon for due diligence to be treated as a reactionary tool, when in spirit it's meant to identify and address risks before harm occurs. And yet, time and time again, we see corporations pleading ignorance. They'll say, oh, we didn't know our suppliers were union busting, or we had no idea that this is how our technology is being used. But honestly, those are the kinds of red flags that proper due diligence should have caught at the very beginning. So what I'm really interested in exploring with you is this. What does the current situation and the failures we're seeing tell us about the limits of due diligence as it's currently practiced? And maybe more importantly, what new pathways do you see for addressing corporate complicity?
I would rather flip it and talk about what is wrong with the way that companies are consciously setting themselves up for failure. So outsourcing, human rights due diligence assessments, or creating 5, 6, 7 tiers between themselves and, where products eventually may be ending up, with little to no oversight. It's setting yourself up for having a good excuse. You can set conditions when you enter into a business relationship. I think you can enter into conditions and say, well, our products should not and cannot be used for or end up in fill in on the dotted line. And if it does, then there's a contractual issue, right? Then there will be a breach of contract. Now, And clearly there's very few corporate actors that want to think and operate that way because, fiduciary duty describes that you only just really focus on getting your maximum profit and not really how you obtain that profit. That's why SOMO does what it does. We have this hub called The Counter, where civil society can request pro bono corporate research, supply chain research, which will help demystify some supply chains and which will help through information that is tucked away in really expensive corporate databases. We dig up that information, we analyze it, we disentangle it, and then we share it. And that can often help, to increase their information position and therefore their power position to hold corporates to account. What I see as a huge challenge in accountability efforts is the level of secrecy enjoyed by corporations and the supply chains. So even apart from how many tiers of suppliers and business partners you can have in a certain value chain, it is the complete lack of transparency about that trade data, customs data is all, especially in Europe, it is entirely confidential, which I find an absurdity. So you can't expect an accountable system if it's allowed to entirely operate in the dark.
Earlier this month, a coalition of 30 countries spanning Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas gathered in Bogota for an emergency meeting of the Hague Group, co-chaired by Colombia and South Africa. 12 states committed to immediately implementing 6 measures through their domestic systems to restrain Israel's assault on the occupied Palestinian territories. These include halting arms transfers to Israel, blocking military-related shipments through ports and flagged vessels, cutting public contracts tied to the occupation, and advancing legal accountability through national and international courts, including support for universal jurisdiction. So let's start envisioning what the future of business and human rights could actually look like in practice. In your view, how viable is universal jurisdiction as a legal pathway for holding corporate actors accountable for complicity in human rights violations committed abroad?
Universal jurisdiction would be the scenario where a court, a state, assumes jurisdiction out of an international principle, not because, for example, the perpetrator or the victim have a connection to that jurisdiction, have the nationality of that jurisdiction. So I think in relation to corporate executives, it would have to be a very blatant and a very in-your-face perpetrator, or accomplice, a corporate accomplice, for that, I think, to be viable. I think in relation to Palestine especially, I think it will be challenging because there would have to be a certain political climate around for a case to be taken under universal jurisdiction. I'm not saying that it's not theoretically possible, but I think it is probably it's not the first avenue I would think about now. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future. If the Hague Group would add to their lists that we will issue, arrest warrants for corporate executives that have been complicit if they enter our jurisdiction, I would love that. It's not unthinkable, but I think it's probably not on the top 5 list of the most likely scenarios to happen. I think it's more likely to happen in the jurisdictions where companies are headquartered, where certain corporate executives have their nationality. So this is something that we are looking into at SOMO, is now keeping track of the nationality of executives, keeping track of the nationality of board members and how long have they been in a company and how often have they received certain information about the role of their corporation in a certain atrocity crime. There's a lot of building up of material, and I think it's a matter of time until we see more of those cases.
So in recent years, corporate accountability has been reduced to press releases, carefully worded statements that sound polished but ultimately say literally nothing. They're crafted to manage reputation, not responsibility. Recognizing that legal systems can be complicated and slow, what can accountability then really look like?
In a broader sense, accountability is, being held to account for your actions. So even if the executive doesn't go to prison next year, or even if the company is not sanctioned this year, accountability also comes from consumers. So consumers have a power to punish corporations, to not go to booking.com to figure out where they're going to stay during the holidays. Control F the UN database and figure out which companies you're no longer going to spend a penny on. I think that is a form of holding to account, especially if it's happening at a large scale. Know that in the boardrooms, they're very cold decisions that are being made. Are we going to renew our contract with arms manufacturer X or Y in Israel? Someone has to sign the paperwork. Someone is signing off. It's not an anonymous apparatus, that corporation. There are decision makers. So I think we have to put the human back into the story. Just like it is real human lives that are getting lost in Gaza and the West Bank every single day, every minute, it is human beings that are signing off on the supplies of surveillance technology. There are human beings that are signing off on the supply of arms, military jet fuel, etc., etc. So these are human choices, and I think we have to bring that back into the mix and focus on that rather than treat the corporate as some kind of an abstract construct. There are real human beings making real human decisions and making a killing, literally.
Absolutely. I mean, recently your team at SOMO released a powerful analysis of trade and foreign investment flows that lays bare just how deeply intertwined the EU and Israeli economies really are. According to the report, the EU is not only Israel's largest trading partner, it's also its biggest source of foreign investment. In fact, the EU is the largest investor in Israel worldwide, nearly twice as big as the United States, with the Netherlands as the top EU member state investing in Israel. I've included a link to the detailed report in the episode show notes for any of our listeners who are interested in diving in deeper. That said, on September 3rd, the Court of Appeals in The Hague will hear a landmark case brought by 10 Palestinian and Dutch civil society organizations, including SOMO, against the Dutch government. The case challenges the Netherlands' failure to meet its international legal obligations to prevent genocide and end support for Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. The coalition is pushing for concrete action, including halting arms exports and corporate involvement in illegal settlements. This appeal follows a 2024 lower court ruling that acknowledged the state's legal obligations under international law, including the duty to prevent genocide and protect human rights, but rejected calls for urgent measures. Seeing more cases such as these offer hope. And given the scale of corporate and state complicity, I'm curious, where do you see real openings within the existing legal system to push for justice?
I think we have to work with what is already theoretically enforceable. I think civil law can offer ways in. They're not perfect, and it is definitely a huge power imbalance that you'd have to overcome. But I think we need to use what is there in the system. And then I see the momentum. So I see in a lot of countries in Europe, especially in Ireland, in Belgium, in Spain, I see there's huge momentum. Public opinion has shifted too slow, but in an unprecedented fashion. It has shifted over the last 2 years. And now there was a court ruling that came out this morning in Belgium that said that the arms exports from Belgium to Israel must be suspended immediately. And for every violation, there is a 50,000 euro fine, which is, it's a bit of an absurdity, right? So how much is a Palestinian life worth, right? But again, it is showing that there can be a court ruling, there can be something, there's a function still for the law, and it is enforceable, and there are baby steps. It's too little, it's too late, but it is happening, and I think it is happening because of this momentum, because of this widespread protest. People not accepting the complicity of their institutions, of their universities, of their companies, of their states. So it's consistent, I think, in almost every country, and it is growing and it is getting louder. So I think the louder that momentum and the demand to end these corporate ties, the more space prosecutors and courts will feel to enforce the laws that are already on the books, and to accept certain cases for moving forward. Is it enough? No. Is it fast enough? Definitely not. But it is all we have to work with. I think we have to, each in our different capacities, have to use the means that we have. When I'm starting to get affected, by a sense of hopelessness or desperation, I think of something that we have in the Netherlands called struikelstenen, literally translated into stumble stones. They're tiles that are put in the pavement in front of houses where Jewish people used to live, were abducted from before they were taken away and killed, exterminated. And so on these stones, you have the name, you have the date of birth, and you have the date of death. And I just remember, like, whenever I feel this desperation creep up on me, I think of this sensation that I have in my body when I see a date of death that is, let's say, 1 month prior to Liberation Day, or 2 weeks prior to when liberation came. Every action, every day mattered. Every day that liberation of camps came sooner saved lives. And this is true for Gaza. This is true for the West Bank. I think every day that we manage to shorten this genocide matters. It matters. It matters lives. So that's what I think we have to keep in mind, that yes, the system is broken and the political complicity is on full display, but we do have things to work with, and we just have to keep doing everything we can to make that shift as soon as possible.
As we've explored in this episode, the complicity of corporations in international crimes is not accidental, it's structural. And in the case of Gaza, it's proving to be profitable. Francesca Albanese's report doesn't just name names, it exposes an entire economy built on dispossession, surveillance, and militarized control, enabled by some of the most powerful companies in the world. The backlash to her work, from sanctions to political attacks, only reinforces how threatening accountability is to those who benefit from impunity. But accountability isn't just about the courtroom. It's about people in every country demanding that their institutions, their governments, and the corporations operating in their name are no longer allowed to profit from war and apartheid. And as we've heard today, every day matters. Every action, no matter how small, brings us one step closer to justice.
Keep amplifying the information. I know that many of us are probably surrounded by silent bystanders, people that are not speaking out, people that are maybe paralyzed, maybe don't know what to do. Keep talking, keep reaching out, keep sharing, because it is sending a signal. Because I think when we stop talking about it, the signal we're sending with silence is that we are consenting, or that we have normalized. So I think we have to continue to be vocal about what is happening and what we can do to stop it. That's the only thing that can grow awareness. And I know how frustrating it is, but it is important, because you will break through taboos where they may exist. You will break through some of the myths that people may have held when it came to Israel-Palestine. Keep sharing, keep disseminating, keep talking, and find your peers, because I think in a lot of places people can feel very lonely and very vulnerable. So look for each other, look out for each other, and stay connected. Don't isolate.
I would like to thank our guest, Lydia de Leeuw, for joining us today and sharing her insights. The Center for Research on Multinational Corporations continues to shed critical light on the legal and economic structures that allow corporate complicity to persist and the pathways we can take to challenge them. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honoré, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.